Good evening, and welcome to Chicago Public Library. I'm Jennifer Lezak with the Cultural, Civic, and Literary Engagement Team in the Adult Services Department. And on behalf of everyone at CPL, welcome. We want to especially welcome you to Chicago Public Library throughout 2023 as we celebrate our 150th anniversary year with a variety of events, celebrations, partnerships, and digital content for all ages throughout the year. For more information on everything we have planned, visit chipublib.org/150 throughout the year. Before we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. I want to thank the Chicago Public Library staff who worked to make this event possible. Books are available for purchase in the lobby, and the author will sign books at the conclusion of the program. We will call you up to get your book signed in groups, so please remain seated after the program and wait for instructions. Tonight's event is also being live streamed on CPL's YouTube and Facebook channels and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event. After the conversation, our guests will take questions from the audience, from those who line up at the microphone in front of the stage, and virtual viewers, please put your questions in the chat. Tonight, Chicago Public Library is pleased to welcome legendary Chicago City Council member and community activist Helen Shiller to speak on her book, Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win, as part of our Voices for Justice speaker series and in celebration of Women's History Month. Helen will be in conversation with Sylvia Ewing. Helen Shiller, raised by migrant Jewish parents, was radicalized by the anti-war and civil rights movements. Shiller went from radical anti-war activist in Wisconsin to a member of a collective of white allies of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, to an elected city council person who helped break the back of the racialized opposition to Harold Washington, Chicago's first black mayor. Beginning in 1987, Shiller was a radical Chicago alderperson for 24 years and participated in the historic fight against the gentrification of a unique, economically and racially mixed Chicago community on the North Side. Her book, Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win, published by Chicago's own Haymarket Publishing, tells the fascinating true story of an individual radical organizer turned independent Chicago City Council member and her 40-year struggle for justice in Chicago. We are so pleased to have her with us tonight as part of our Voices for Justice series, especially as we celebrate Women's History Month. Joining Helen tonight on stage is Sylvia Ewing, friend of CPL. Sylvia is a communicator and a curator. Jose Olivares selected her poem Origin Story for the Poetry Corner in The Reader. She was the producer and host of Lift Every Voice Chicago, a celebration of 250 years of African American poetry and song for the Chicago Public Library, and she partners on many other events. Sylvia is an inductee into the History Makers African American Archives for her award-winning radio and television journalist work, and a recipient of the 2020 Illinois Humanities Award. The author of Comfort and Joy is also a meditation teacher, a nonprofit executive, and a public television host on PBS's WTTW. Please join me in welcoming Helen Shiller and Sylvia Ewing to the CPL stage.
Thank you, Jen. What a warm, warm welcome. And thank you, folks who came out in the audience, and thank you to those at home or watching us on streaming. We've got so much to talk about. We've known each other for a long time. We're at the grandchildren stage. But I'm also here as a fan and an admirer of an incredibly brave woman, appropriate for Women's History Month, who truly walked the walk at a time when you didn't have likes and you didn't have, folks to endorse you online. You had to put yourself on the line. So let's get started. Is that okay? Give Helen another round of applause. And yourselves. Okay, hi Margie, I see you in the audience. I said your name, okay, I hope I was allowed. I wanna start with, I think it's on. Give it a little.
Hello?
Helen turned off her mic because she takes control.
Is it on?
It is on now. So we often talk about, I should tell my story, I've got things to say. And I remember talking with you when you were first thinking about this. You were so prepared, you had kept notes and dates of everything, but what made you finally commit to doing the book, to doing Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win?
So the idea for the book really was initiated by George Atkins before I left City Council. And George was my main political partner. He was always there for everything, and unfortunately just recently passed. So this in a way is dedicated to him for me. He really wanted me to write it before I left City Council. And I'm like, I don't have the time, it's not, not focused. So I spent a lot of time over the next decade really thinking about that. Tom Johnson, who also, unfortunately, we lost a few years back, was also really, really insistent that I write something. He wanted me to do a book of photographs because I have all of the archives, the photographic archives from all the magazines and newspapers we did and all of our activities, and he really wanted a book that reflected the people of Uptown. So I played with both of those and finally really felt ready to start writing stories, at least, to figure out what to do and whether I should do pictures or whatever, and I started doing that. 2018, I had some friends like Achio Bayhouse who said, you have to sit down and write, and she made me sit down at her kitchen table for a month and do some work. And out of that, I came up with an outline, which was really how I wanted to deal with the stories, and started really getting serious. But I was still not sure what I was going to do, and then the pandemic hit. I got word that Tom had been, and his wife had been murdered, and I said, okay, now I really have to get serious. And what else was there to do? It was the pandemic. This was in April of 2020, and then I did, and I wrote it. I was motivated not just by, these folks were bringing it up to me constantly, but behind that was, the fact that we had done something in Uptown that was really unique, and I had addressed and approached the office of alderman a little different. I believe that you have to show truth to power. I believe that prestige of power often gets in the way. I think that there are serious issues with the fact that we have to raise money in order to be able to get elected, and that you can't separate that from how you look at what you're doing. And so we did a lot of things that were just unique, and that for me were able to not have me fall into the pitfalls, or help me avoid as much as I could the pitfalls that I saw many of my colleagues falling into, but also that I just didn't think were helpful in terms of addressing the issues we had in the city. So that really motivated me to try and find a way to tell the story, and there were so many things that were happening at the same time. So in the winter of 2016, during the primary for the Democratic Party for the presidential election, I was one of almost hardly anybody living in a cottage on Cape Cod, going through all of the about 15,000 of what's probably a good 50 or 60,000 negatives that had gotten digitized, making a database and trying to decide, should this be the book or that? That was part of my process. And but because I was in Cape Cod, all the local news was about the primary, and with a heavy dose of what was going on, especially between Bernie Sanders, who was kind of a favorite son and of New England, and Hillary Clinton. And as I'm listening to that, what became apparent to me was that they were going at each other in such a way that it was really going to be impossible to have a united front going into the election. And I was sure that Trump was going to win, and really terrified.
Well, and let's
So I thought
let's
that
take
was
it
pretty
further
relevant,
back.
right?
It is absolutely relevant, and a strong reason to have that commitment, and also another time when you were ahead of the game, because so many people, including journalists, were shocked and traumatized when they didn't expect him to win. But I want to talk about something that you did early on. You always, throughout your career, got the value of media, got the value of creating your own spaces for content well before podcasts and things like that. Talk about that and the spaces both in Uptown and prior to that when you created places to gather information.
So my experience always was that the media never quite got it. And so from early on, as soon as I started doing any kind of organizing, it was clear that whatever the issue was and whoever I was working with, we needed our own voice, and we needed to tell our own story. It is definitely, from my perspective, a truism that history is told from the point of view of the victors. And so how do you tell the story of the struggles and the day-to-day struggles that people have, the reality of people's lives? So from the very beginning, when I left college, I moved to Racine, Wisconsin for a few years before I came to Chicago. And we were organizing there, and we connected with folks in Milwaukee who were connected to the Black Panther Party. They weren't quite yet a chapter, but they had papers, and we would buy them from them and sell them. And in return, they would, and also as part of our interaction, we started doing a newsletter for them. I can't remember who said what, but clearly we each needed something that was very specific to what was happening in our community to go along with the national and international information that was in the Black Panther paper. In Racine, we started our own newspaper called Midnight Special, and we opened up a bookstore called the People's Bookstore, which, because for us, we wanted people to have more and more information. But the newspaper was really to be able to reflect the day-to-day struggles that people had. In Chicago, we did the same thing. We had a series of newspapers. I can't remember all the names, but
All
by
city,
well, that was later.
That was later.
In 1975, we began Keep Strong magazine, which we started a print shop so that we could have our own literature. And then we did Keep Strong magazine, which was published until 1980, it was a magazine, 64 pages. It reflected literally initially day-to-day struggles of people to survive with a focus on Uptown, but we ended up dealing with communities all over the city, international stories, national stories. And then in 1980, the end of 1980, we pivoted it into All Chicago City News.
Well, early days of telling your story, owning the narrative, you own the issue. And that was something that was very important.
Let me just say one thing.
Please.
Is that an entire set of Keep Strong magazine is in the Municipal Reference Library in this library.
Shout out to the library. Everything you need, you can find at some branch. Absolutely. Where did your early commitment to activism and human rights come from?
Well, I think there were a lot of factors. My parents were very politically, they had lots of political discussions, arguments. They actually agreed, but they'd argue with each other all the time. So just, we had dinner every evening at 6, and there was always a political conversation. When I was born, we lived in Brooklyn, and the Brooklyn Dodgers were like, they were our team, right? And they were the underdogs. And a month before, I think it was a month or a couple months before I was born, they brought on Jackie Robinson, and that made them heroes to my parents. And so they talked a lot about that. They were both immigrants from Eastern Europe, my father from Latvia, and he had come here alone when he was 12, had to pretend that he was 16, and had assumed at that point that his entire family had been killed in the Holocaust. So there was a lot of discussions about that and what had happened. He had had experiences with, he had had a visit from the FBI when in 1950, shortly after the indictments, I believe, of the Rosenbergs. And it turned out that someone that, he was a chemist, and he had his own little factory making paints, inks, and lacquers for textiles in Brooklyn, in Greenpoint, New York, and somebody that he knew as a chemist had asked him to use his lab a couple times. His lab was literally a table that was twice the size of this one, with a couple shelves above, and some kind of machine that you measured stuff on, according to my brother. And this guy, it turns out, was somebody that had a relationship with the Rosenbergs. So the FBI came looking for him. It was very traumatic. He ended up with a heart attack, and then they left him alone. And it was a big family secret, and I knew something had happened, but I didn't actually know about it until a week before he died. He finally gave me the story. But the reaction was immediate. My mother took all of her books. We lived in an apartment in Queens, and there was a sunken living room. And literally, I remember her throwing all the books in the living room and then getting rid of them. But one book that survived was a book by Howard Fast called Freedom Road. And it was the first chapter book I read, and it was about Reconstruction and the sort of destruction of Reconstruction. And it infuriated me. I don't know, I was 9 or 10, but it really upset me. So there were things like that I think are just cumulative. And then I ended up in a school in Vermont, very small school, 100 students, and among those students were a handful of the daughters and sons of some of civil rights leaders and both intellectuals and activists. So the head of the Highlander School, his son was there. Pete Seeger's daughter was my roommate. There were the editor of Monthly Review's son was there. So it was that kind of mix, along with a lot of people, well, only 100 students at any given time, but along with any number. It was really sort of the bad boys and girls of the Northeast who couldn't quite make it in other prep schools, so they ended up here. It was like sort of like the last place to go.
Perfect place for Helen Shiller.
Yeah, so I was there. And then I went to Madison, to Wisconsin, to college, and got involved in the anti-war movement.
I want to talk about your early involvement with the Panther Party coming back in Chicago. You know, it's come full circle because the West Side Justice Center is something that your family founded on the West Side. But talk about those early days and what it meant to be an ally.
Well, first, the first time I really had a direct interaction was when Fred Hampton came to campus, Madison, and it was right around the time of the Black student strike demanding a Black Studies program. And several of us got really involved. I spent a lot of time running around. There was a group of us that ran into buildings, took over classes to explain to the students who were there why they should be supporting the strike, with somebody outside sort of watching the hallway to alert us when we had to run out because the campus police were coming. So we did that, and I really, you know, it was really important to me. And then Fred was there, and we went and saw him, and I read about it in the book, and that had a huge impact. I knew that I wanted to have some kind of interaction or relationship with them, and I knew that for me, I had been thinking, my plan was to weave somewhere. I was a weaver on a big loom. And my plan was to go either to Mexico or Sweden when I left college. But then I got recruited midway, just a month or two before it was time for me to decide where I was going, to go to Racine and organize there. And that attracted me because I felt like I had a responsibility. If these were things that I believed in, then I had a responsibility to talk to other people who were white who weren't so sure, or who were on the, you know, who had not had any kind of challenge to their feelings about racism or their feelings about white supremacy, and who clearly were in a position to benefit from a change in the way things were organized. People who were poor, people who had serious issues with survival, and so that's what we did in Racine. And in that process, initially, we're working with these folks in Milwaukee, but when Fred Hampton was killed, which was at the end of '69, which was the same year I'd gone there, I graduated, so I'd only been there, we'd been there 5-6 months. And it was actually the time that Mark Zalkin, who later on, who was Brendan's dad, who had recruited
Brendan,
me.
your son, read the book, you'll know.
So Mark and I were there, but we were literally talking about we were going to leave, we were not getting along, whatever, and then we heard Fred was killed, and decided that we had a responsibility to go back to Racine, and we did, and to stay there. But whereas in the week before he died, Fred had dismantled a lot of chapters, and this wasn't quite a chapter yet in Milwaukee, so they were dismantled. So we had to connect with someone else to get papers, and we ended up connecting with the Rockford chapter. And the leadership there, the two people in the leadership was a guy named Ray Lewis and Harold Bell. And Harold Bell was one of the people that was in the apartment when Fred Hampton was killed. We set up, we were introduced to them, we began getting papers with them, they started doing political education about once a month with us. We gave them a car, the car died, it was a big joke, I was really sorry. But we maintained a relationship over time, and that was very helpful for us in terms of really getting a better understanding of where they were coming from and being able to really use that in the work that we did. We learned a lot about the survival programs, which were programs really about survival pending revolution. I have to say, we all really thought there was going to be one pretty soon. We were quite wrong. And, but the notion, and I think it still holds firm, is that There's a lot of things that people need to survive, and the government doesn't provide a response, or we felt that the government had a response to deal with those things that people couldn't get because they fell out of the economy. And they weren't doing it. So a lot of the survival programs ended up really paving the way for changes in the way things work. That's where we have the breakfast program. It's because of the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party that we have, or the Illinois chapter, that we actually have, through the work they did in their free clinic, acknowledgement was created about sickle cell anemia. Research was done or acknowledged, and treatment was actually created, and tests available and things like that. So there were a number of things that they did that really, their early patrolling of the police in California, I think, is paralleled today by the patrols that people do with cell phones and things like that with new technologies. So the work that the survival programs were not about providing service to somebody. They were about engaging the community and understanding that collectively are the things that we can do, and as a result of that we can force changes that are necessary to allow for people to survive pending revolution.
And sustainability. So we talked about the things that government wasn't doing. Talk about your getting into government. What was the impetus for you to run?
Okay, so I came to Chicago in 1972 and didn't take more than a couple of weeks of canvassing to realize that you couldn't do anything in Chicago unless you dealt with politics. I mean, I would canvass and the precinct captain would canvass behind me, contradict everything I said, and I'd have to start all over again the next time I saw the same people. So it was very clear immediately that that was the case, which led very quickly to, well, about the same time, we had in Chicago a couple things happen in 1973. One was that there was a citywide conference about police brutality and establishing community control, and it had there were locally elected. I mean, there were black officials from all over the country that came to it. Gary Hatcher from Gary, Mayor Hatcher from Gary, was one that comes to mind. The African American Patrolmen's League were there. Renault Robinson was there. Fannie Lou Hamer came in. There were multiple people. I can't think of them all. And actually, there was a discussion about the Panthers had been for that whole year developing lots of conversations and developing an ordinance for community control of police, which is not went a little further, but actually is really reflected to a certain extent in the recent elections that we had for these police councils. At any rate, that was happening, and immediately we knew that what we were going to have to do was to organize and lobby and inform people so that would be effective to get an ordinance. So right away we were thinking we have to change the law, right? But also in California, Bobby Seale and Elaine Brown were running for mayor and city council, respectively, of the Oakland City Council. And so that led us into a discussion about how engaging in politics was really another survival program. In 1975...
Wait, let me just hear you say that again for the young people.
Engaging in political activity was also another survival program.
Okay, go on.
Okay. In 1975, 1973, 3, Chacha, I guess 3 or 4, Chacha Jimenez, 1973, who was the head of the Young Lords, had been underground, came out, addressed his legal issues, and announced that he was running for alderman in the 46th Ward. The 46th Ward at that time had a little bit larger chunk of Lakeview than it does today, and about 2/3 of Uptown. And we were obviously in Uptown, but we had also had some home distribution routes that we did with the newspapers in Lakeview, and began working with them immediately and very closely. And the predecessor to the Intercommunal Survival Committee, which is the group I worked with, had been the People's Information Center in Lincoln Park, and had been very close to the Young Lords when they were there in the 60s. So, and of course in Uptown there was a history of a relationship in the Rainbow Coalition.
And that was Fred Hampton's Rainbow
Right.
Coalition, right?
So at any rate, so Chacha ran in 1975. He didn't make it into a runoff, but he did very respectively. And there are a lot of things that came out of it, some of which I talk about in the book. But so all of that led to 1978. The end of 77, Chris Cohn was the alderman and resigned to become head of the regional head of HEW, which is now HSS. And he left the vacancy. And we looked at each other and said, okay, we need someone to run. The ward at that time was Uptown, some of Lakeview, and the entire lakefront, which at that time had 10,000 Jewish voters, mostly elderly. And they looked around and they said, Helen has a BA, she has a degree, she's Jewish, and she's a woman. Helen, you're it. And I'm like, what? Anyway, that's how I first ran. The special election was in the spring of 1978. We didn't do very well at all, but it was the beginning of the political season for the regular municipal elections, which happened in '79. In the primary, I came in first, but didn't have 50% of the vote. I had something like 47%. And in the general, I lost by about 200 votes. Over the course of the next couple of months, or years maybe, what we were really spreading our support, growing our support, and we learned from multiple people about several ways in which about 2,000 votes have been stolen from us. So that allowed us to protect those 2,000 votes, and I'd only lost by 150 votes, or thereabouts. But I had sworn I'd never run again. And in 1983, when Harold announced that he was running, I just wanted to coordinate an area for him, but we ended up agreeing that someone should run, but it wasn't me. Paul Siegel, who was the head of the Black Lung Association, agreed to run, which was very helpful. He probably got about 1,000 votes that Harold never would have gotten. He had a lot of respect from a lot of people, and I coordinated the ward for both of them. But then Harold started after the 29-21 situation occurred, and for those folks that don't mind, I remember
Council wars.
There was council wars. There was an opposition to Harold, and it was initially 29 against 21. And Harold asked me to join the political education project, which Mercedes Millette and Joe Gardner were coordinating, and I was the sole staff person. I ended up seeing Harold a lot as a result of that, because initially my job was to recruit attorneys to deal with all of
Helen, when did you run?
When did I run?
Yeah, I want to get to you, because you know all these folks, and some of our folks know them.
Harold wanted me to run.
Yes.
So he asked me to go on a trip to Israel as a photographer. Not the greatest photographer in the world, but he'd seen me a lot with the camera. I went, and it took me a while. It was several years before I realized the reason I'm on that trip is because he wants me to run. I never could really understand it. But when it became clear that it was something I had to think about, even though I'd sworn I'd never do it, I knew I could beat the guy who was there, which is a whole bunch of other stories that are in the book that you should read, because you should read.
Well, I want to get to that, because you were a pivotal part of his administration and a pivotal part of the opposition later on. You talk about how young folks and people today are surprised at and horrified in some ways at the links between some police and white supremacy, and that was something that you faced. Talk about how hard it was to win and to prevail.
There was a great deal of racism in Uptown, a lot of tension. There were a lot of, Uptown in the 70s, when we got there, had everybody in it. But it was the largest concentration of poor white people in the city of Chicago, which is why we went there. But there were also a very significant population of Native Americans who were probably the largest in any urban area at that time in the country. There was still a significant number of people that had been interned, Japanese Americans who had been interned in Arizona and California, who had come to Chicago through Uptown, Several had gone in many other places, but there were still quite a few in Uptown. There was the oldest black community outside of the Black Belt is in Uptown. The federal government had financed in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, a bunch of high-rise buildings for affordable housing with low interest rates, and about 4,000 of those units were in Uptown and Lakeview, and about a good portion of those were in the ward. And who lived in there were people from all over the country, people from all over the city, and people from all over the world. Each had its own character, but if you put them all together, it was pretty remarkable.
That was Uptown.
Yeah. So, but also, so there were two things that were commonly true. One was that people had lots of different day-to-day struggles to survive, and the other was that they had, for the most part, the majority of people had already been displaced, if not once, numerous times, and weren't ready to be, were prepared, were ripe to resist that. And so that was part of the dynamic that we had. But there were still tensions between people, and one of the things that we faced was people who were organizing, doing neo-Nazi and Klan organizing, and among those were police officers, and no one held them in check. So it was not uncommon for, I saw on a number of occasions, flyers talking about, with neo-Nazi literature, that were being handed out by individual police officers to some of the white groupings of people. You know, every block had its own little gang thing going. And when, during the period of time when Harold was first elected, there was a guy that I knew, I didn't mention it, but I'd also gone to Cuba early on in '68, and on a trip of SDS trip with about 30 people, and there was someone on that trip who turned out to be a federal informant. He testified in front of either HUAC or another intelligence committee in '72, so we knew who he was. He shows up in Uptown in '83. He becomes a chief of staff for the existing alderman, and who ironically was Jewish and wore being Jewish on his sleeve. And this guy started organizing these individual groupings into a gang called the White Rebels, and they were, there was a basement we discovered where they went on the weekends and had various different people come and give them political education from the Klan and from the neo-Nazis.
Well, these things are what's, you know, old is new again, or however that saying goes. Housing has always been a big issue for you. I know that was something you worked with Harold, you know, with some success and some challenges. Talk about the housing task force that you initiated as one of the innovative parts of your being an alder.
So first, let me just say that I think that I totally agree when people say people need a job to survive, because that gives them the resources they need. But bottom line, you need to have stability to keep a job. And in order to have stability, number one, you need a roof over your head. You need a place where you can put your things. You need a place where you have the potential to be organized, keep your clothes, to be able to be clean, to do all of those things, to have your peace, to be able to go out in the world and do things. So housing is critical, and the housing conditions in Uptown were horrific. And they totally, and they were, it was people's, it was so key to the destabilization of people's individually, to the families, to the households, and to the community. So it was really very important to address that. And so also, because of so many of these issues, there were a lot of people that were homeless, especially because there was constant tearing down and burning up of people's homes without any replacement housing. And I'm not going more into detail because we're running out of time, but I put a lot more in the book. So in the 90s, I'd done a lot of work with not just creating housing, but also with the Homeless Coalition and with the coalition of organizations in the ward that addressed all of these different things. So one of the commanders and I would have breakfast or lunch once a month and sort of talk about our different perspectives on these things, and also how to find some innovative solutions. And we agreed to have to do a 24-hour, to get the mayor's bus which is amazing because this was when they said, Shiller, don't talk to Shiller. We got the mayor's bus. We invited, we decided we'd have 3 different tours based on the schedule of the police tours, and that we would invite the Department of Human Services, anyone who'd worked with the homeless, emergency services, also social workers, any of the police sergeants, the commander came to everything as I did, but any of the sergeants that were particularly, that were working during those hours and those shifts, and all of the policymakers for the organizations that operated at that time serving the homeless. And we would then visit all of those organizations and their programs that was appropriate for that time slot. The person who organized it for me was a staff person. His name is Evelyn Diaz, who's now the head of Heartland and Alliance. And she helped me put all that together and be in touch with everyone. And we did the 3 tours, and then sat down with the commander, and he said, look, I have an idea. Why don't I'm going to ask for 2 volunteers. And if I get them, I will have them work just solely with the homeless. And he did, and they did, and it was an amazing process. And it went on while he was commander, which was for a couple of years. And one of the things that really was clear to me was that these 2 officers became advocates for the homeless in terms of trying to figure out the appropriate, understanding what their needs were and trying to explain that to their other officers, so that when there was interaction, it was interaction that addressed really solving the problem rather than, just acting out of things that assumptions that may or may not be true. It was really pretty amazing.
Well, that's one of the things that you did. The terms change, unhoused, whatever we call it, the situation still exists, and you had some innovative approaches back in the day. What are you most proud of from your being an alder person? And I have to say, I know that you loved budgets, you loved arcane information and geeking out on things that other people might overlook, which I always found to be interesting. But what are you most proud of from your era?
Things. I will say this about
from your book, Helen, from your book.
Well, I wrote a lot of stories, so clearly, there are 2 things I want to say. One is that I'm not that great on finance. I just think that you follow the money. And if I was going to be effective in a city council where the mayor and the majority of the council said we don't want to hear from her, and especially around housing, then and for me, it was really critical to have a really top-class service office. That was really the most important thing, because it was a vehicle by which I could show what I thought how the city should really operate, and also then be able to really talk about people about why it was that we needed to make the changes and why it was that everybody needed. That was an office that had to be accessible to everyone, regardless of what their income was, regardless of what their race was, and regardless of who they voted for. And that was really important. But the only way I was going to be able to do that if I followed the money, because I had to know what was available and find how I was going to get it when everybody was against me having it. So that was very important, and I think we were successful doing that because of the method of work, which was to really respect the people who were doing the work and always go after the policymakers. And then create a situation. I took advantage of the fact that nobody wanted to talk to me because they were afraid because the mayor's office or the people around him were saying not to. So it became, but I went to every budget hearing, and I wouldn't let anyone I had a mantra: no question is a stupid question, because they always tried to make me feel like I was stupid for the questions I asked, and I made them answer in regular language, and I absolutely never, ever, ever thanked anybody who'd ever done anything that helped us, and when they knew I wasn't going to do it, they started helping me, because if I didn't get appropriate response from a city department, I would call them out on the budget floor, and they'd get into trouble. So I figured out that dynamic, and it served me very well. So that was, I think, the point there, and I guess it expresses, and one thing that really was, that I am proud of, was that in spite of the old boys all-boys club. And in spite of the status quo and the assumptions and consensus about how you do things, we were able to make some changes that changed the direction and the political will on a citywide basis, at least for that time. When I became alderman, the best example of how the other aldermen felt about me was a conversation I heard someone repeated to me from Bill Beavers, which was they went to his office. This was, I think, about a domestic violence shelter, but it was also about housing. And he looked at this woman and he said to her, "Who do you think I am? Do I look like Helen Shiller?" And from that point on, we ended up being able to work, at least on the budget, many years later. But by that time, we had a citywide ordinance on affordable housing. And so it was important that was really very important to me.
Well, I was looking through the book. There's so many wonderful things here. There is a cartoon actually drawn by my ex, which it's Chicago is so incestuous. But the point of the book is,
I didn't know until like 10 years ago. Like in the midnight, like
Yeah.
maybe even not, about 10 years, not
well,
even.
I had more than one husband, but that's
No,
another.
no, but
that's
you
for
came-
another
But
interview.
you came to my house and you looked at this comic and you said, "Oh my God!"
That's
you know, I
right.
did that.
That's right. But the point of it was that Schiller woman, and you
Schiller
were
broad.
that Schiller broad. you were
Stop that, Shiller Broad.
a force in a way that people are uncomfortable doing, and the results live into this day. I'd like to wrap up before we come to you, so get your questions ready. Don't be shy. And those watching virtually will take your questions as well. But you you helped to start the AIDS task force or the AIDS response. Talk about how you shamed people into that as well.
Well, that was really act up, but I just.
But you
I did it.
loved
No,
them.
I was the voice. So we had a serious AIDS crisis. People were dying left and right. People were terrified, and they were therefore being demonized. And there was a consortium of groups that were addressing AIDS that came out of the community, and a lot of health professionals, and they had put together a list of about 50 recommendations, as I recall, of things that the city should be doing. The federal government had been responding mostly after Ryan White. They had bills with his name in it, who was a young white boy who had AIDS as a result of transfusion.
Right.
And it became a national thing, and it had a face of it that wasn't
Acceptable.
That was acceptable, and so consequently there was now some federal money, but there was no city commitment. So the folks at Windy City Times and some of the activists came to me. They had a resolution that was going to be printed in Windy City, and they wanted me to, they were wondering if I would present this as a resolution to the city council. And the issue and the core of it was to triple the spending on AIDS. And I said, sure. So Danny Sotomayor, who was one of the leaders and organizers of ACT UP, and also was seriously sick with AIDS, they had developed this whole response. And apparently at the press conference, after I introduced this resolution, and I think this was 91, 92, I think it was 91, the mayor's initial response was, we're going to do this over my dead body, or something like that. And,
In your book, it's Over My Dead Body.
and thank you. And for a month, the ACT UP was one time every single day. They found out the mayor's public schedule, picked something on it, brought their big banner, ACT UP banner, and hurled it out in front of him and made an issue about tripling the spending on AIDS. So then I started getting things like, we can't do it, there's no one who's going to do it, what's going to happen, even if they did it, what they'd spend the money on, blah, blah, blah. And I would say, look, here's the suggestions. All they have to do is follow the suggestions. And it took maybe a month, and then we had hearings. It took maybe a month or two, and the mayor just saying, I don't want to hear about this anymore, I think, that I get a call one day from Pat Hewells. Now, I had, just previous to this, done a campaign to strengthen our sanctions against South Africa by demanding that the 3 financial institutions that were still invested in South Africa divest. And we successfully passed that ordinance, but only after I had written 17 versions of it, and then they wrote a version, and I just had to tweak that. So I decided I'm not doing the ordinance. This is a budget amendment. It's easy, and it really requires saying where the money's coming from. They can decide where the money's coming from. We'll do the resolution to force the issue. So Hughes called me in the morning, 8 o'clock in the morning before a council meeting, and he said, can we sign on to your ordinance? And I said, sure, as long as you write it. And he said, oh, okay. And so it got written that day, and we passed it. And if you take, they created a spot in the department, and staff put someone in charge, hired actually one of the people who had been part of putting the AIDS stuff together, and a doctor, and they hired her to run this operation. So between that and the money they put into it, we tripled the spending on AIDS.
Well, and there was a lot of strategy behind that, and part of what you learned. Let's open this up to questions, if you have any from online, or come on down, folks.
Come on down if you want to ask a question, and we'll start with one from our virtual viewer here.
Sounds good.
Which is, Helen, what advice do you have for women who are interested in running for office in Chicago?
Great.
Don't tell anybody, don't let anyone tell you either that you can't do it, that you're stupid, that you don't know what you're talking about. Make sure you know what your core is, remember your plumb line, and follow it. But I also think you really, and the other thing I would say is plan on seeing door to door at least 5,000 people before the first election.
Don't write off young people, because they will follow issues. They don't like our commercials, but they care about issues.
Got to talk to people.
Has there been any current aldermen or in the city council that have been influenced by you to run for alderman or being part of the council today?
For sure, Angela Clay, who's running in the 46th Ward.
Yeah. Thank you.
And there's some good folks that might be following in your footsteps. Thank you for that. Are there other questions?
We got another one from online.
Please.
What was the thing that you could not achieve in your time that you hope that today we would be able to achieve with Chicago City Council?
Well, there's a lot of things that nothing ever is complete, and there are a number. I think that I don't think that the political will the level at which we've gotten political will committed, for instance, to affordable housing has been maintained. I think that there's some of that is there, but not at the level that we need to be able to address continue to address that issue and to find creative ways to further it. And I'm hopeful that that will be changed in this next council. But it's not just that. For me, the other primary issue throughout the time that I've been in Chicago has been the issue of police misconduct, and truly the issue of public safety, which I think is public safety, it's not crime. If we deal with the underlying factors, we deal with instability in people's lives, we deal with the health and welfare of people every single day, and everything that implies, that we go a long way towards creating a situation where we have real public safety, because we have a situation where we don't have the kind of level of acting out that sometimes we feel we have to do just to be able to survive. And if we're able to then have a police department that is coordinated with all of those efforts, we have a situation where there's a lot more understanding, communication, and ability to be able to solve problems. And that's why we need accountability. And hopefully that we'll see some of it through these new police councils. I think the potential is there, but they were hamstringed a little bit in the way the ordinance was ultimately decided. And as in everything else in democracy, it's dependent upon people to make democracy work, and that means the engagement and the involvement. So I think that there's so much that needs to be done. I think that this book is really just my slice of my engagement. There are people who did a lot of things, and a lot of stuff has changed and improved in terms of the resources or the potential for resources and the ability to do things. We need to make sure that that potential is realized, but that we also are in sync with the way in which technology is developed, the world is developed, so that we can really make a better choice and we can move further on all of these items.
Thank you. Next question.
In the beginning of this talk, you had mentioned the issue of money and being elected, and I think campaign finance reform is really important. No one seems to be working on that now. Would you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So the problem with campaign finance reform is that we don't have it, that the Supreme Court has really made it difficult, that it's possible for people with huge amounts of money to spend it, and without any way for people who don't have huge amounts of money to have an even playing field. This election, the municipal election, in the city of Chicago, we have some restrictions on how much you can put in a campaign, but we also have a state law that says if someone self-funds themselves, that eliminate over a certain amount, that eliminates those restrictions. So we have a candidate who has self-funded himself beyond that amount, and so it becomes necessary, I think people feel, to get money from various different so-called social interest groups, whatever they are, in order, or PACs or what have you, in order to do it. So there's a huge amount that needs to be changed. I'm not sure what's possible because of the nature of our governmental situation at the current time and the nature of our Supreme Court and the fact that since they made this decision that corporations are individuals, it's really hard to maintain that. What I did in my first term, I'm very hands-on, and I have to kind of a control freak. So in my first term, I was like, I did the D2s are the reports you have to fill out to the Board of Elections that reflect who gave you money and what you did with it. And I was right on top of it. I wanted to make sure it was perfect, that we didn't, we got everything right. And towards the end of that, I realized that that was a big mistake, that I really did not want to know who was giving me money, at least not how much they were giving me. I knew that I needed to raise money, so I recruited people to do the raising for me. And I knew that I had to interact with people, both who were giving me money and who weren't, because they were all part of the support that let me get reelected. And they all came to my fundraisers. So I might be that I could look and say, I knew this person probably gave me some money or this person probably didn't. But I didn't know what they gave me. I didn't know how much it was, and I didn't care, and I wouldn't let anyone tell me. If you came to my office with a check, I never saw it. And if you asked me about giving me a check, I tell you, send you to someone else or tell you just how to do it, but I wasn't going to have anything to do with it.
That's not how they do it today.
It was really, well, part of when we were talking about the book and whether I should write it, George and I had this conversation, and we both laughed about it. He said, Helen, no one's ever going to do what you did. You at least should talk about what you did. But I don't know that, I think they'd have to do different things. I know nationally AOC says she doesn't take any money from PACs and things. You have to figure out what you're going to do and what's possible, because the bottom line is you have to have a way to get your message out. One way is you deal with people face to face, and on a award basis, you might be able to do a lot of that, but you still need literature. You have to give people something, and that costs some money. So I think that this is a real issue, but I don't think that it is something you can wallpaper over. And we need to understand the depth of it and then talk about the things that individually people can do.
Thank you.
What do you have to say to the people who have ambitious goals and want to get started, especially with social justice and grassroots organization, but are just overwhelmed about where to start?
Thank you.
Okay.
And then our last question.
So first, I would say it's really important to remember that mountains get moved shovelful by shovelful. So nothing happens overnight, but it does, and if there's more people shoveling, there's quicker the mountain gets moved. So I think that we have to find ways to do, one step after the other. I also think it's important to remember that you really can't go from A to Z. You have to really go through the steps to really make things change. But that doesn't, and things around us, sometimes it's not ripe, movements create opportunities and moments in history that then are the realization of a lot of work. So having that perspective, I think, might help in avoiding getting really discouraged. But I think having a collective group of people, a group of people that collectively work together is really important with a common goal and a common idea. And that constant conversation and engagement is really critical, but it's really hard if you don't have a perspective that lets you see that it's a process and you're going forward.
Hello. I just wanted to ask, based on your experience as a grassroots organizer and as somebody who's worked inside inside the political institutions that are in our city, what is your opinion after going through all of this, of the conception that I think a lot of young people, especially post 2020, might be feeling that that real political change or real change of whatever kind is going to come from without rather than from within. Just as a counterpoint, what do you feel about that as somebody who may have walked through that already?
I think that to have change, you have to have power. And to have power, you have to deal with the power that exists. That's the meaning of speaking truth to power, in some measure. That you can't, you don't have to be part of something to be part of it. I mean, I was, quote unquote, inside because I was an alderman. It didn't mean that I had to go along with everything. It didn't mean that I had to agree with everything. It didn't even mean that I had to agree with the main direction in which we were going. My job was to challenge what we were doing in order to make it be more effective and really in service of the people. And to define a different method of work and a different way for the bureaucracy to function. We considered ourselves, I considered everyone in my office, we considered ourselves bureaucracy busters. Our job was to force the issue and get stuff done for people, to look at problems from the point of view of the most serious manifestation of the problem and find a solution and fight for a solution that not only addressed that problem from that perspective, but took into consideration people, the whole ring of people who were affected as you went out and how they'd be affected by that solution that you were proposing so that there wouldn't be a negative impact and there wouldn't be negative collateral impacts. I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have done that without people on the outside making these demands, making the needs that people had really front and center so that they couldn't be ignored anymore. But there has to be also people that are in positions of power or have access to power to force the issue there and make the changes. I never felt, I don't think ever, that I was able to go as far as I wanted to go, but I was always able to go as far as I went because there was a sea that was created for me to swim in and that I could use to be able to, that was also useful in bringing other people along who didn't necessarily want to, because that sea was bringing them along as well. Because there were people there outside saying, oh my God, you have to do this or you'll suffer a consequence. And that obviously shifts over to some of the people that are working inside as well, and you change minds, and then you change actions. But I think that we have a symbiotic relationship, and it's a mistake for us to say we're going to just stay outside, because when we do that, we give away our power. There's a real, we used to say all power to the people. That was an important concept. The people united really can change a world. And so much of what we do, and so much of when they're in history, if you look at history and when there's forward movement, there's always a reaction to be able to hold back and to maintain by the people who are benefiting from what exists and to hold that power. And what corresponds to that, just think about the last 10, 15 years in the country, as part of that defense is that consistently is an attempt to create fear, to play on racial divisions and racial fears, and to make people be afraid that if they act in their own interest to make a change, that somehow that change is not going to work and they'll be worse off than they currently are when they're already bad off, or where we're going down a path that's going to make us really bad off. So I think that it is really important that we acknowledge that we have to be there, we have to confront the power, but we have to be strong enough to do it, and we get there by organizing.
I'm so glad that we had a young person wrap us up and ask that question.
Thank you.
Please give our questioners a round of applause and Helen Shiller a round of applause. And I'm going to share, I was getting kind of teary-eyed, hearing this, because you were saying our slogans in many ways about people and power. But our friend Laura Washington, political analyst at ABC7, wrote on the back of your book something that I want to wrap up with. For more than half a century, Helen Shiller has been the radical's radical. She has led countless progressive causes, from the battle against police brutality to bureaucracy busting, to fighting against poverty, to fighting for racial equality and equity. Her story is a go-to battle blueprint for the fights of today and for those to come. And it is a dare worth taking, and that is daring to struggle, daring to win. I'm so moved. Briefly, what do you want your book to accomplish?
I'm hopeful that it gives some encouragement and to people who want to change the world, who want us to go in a forward-looking direction, not a backward-looking direction, who want to, and hopefully there are lessons there that will be helpful to them to do so.
Show this, stream this YouTube thing, whatever on the channel, to someone that you love, to a young person, have a family discussion about it, be a part of spreading the word about factual information about our history in a world where books are burned and banned, and just be a part of spreading the story. Thank you. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks so much. Round of applause to Sylvia and Helen. This is a good time to remind
Especially
you
for Sylvia.
that this book is available at your Chicago Public Library to check out. We also have copies available in the lobby if you'd like to purchase one from the bookseller out there, and we'll start the book signing here in just a few moments. Thanks for being here, everyone.